Now, as we've already mentioned, Lincoln was a complex man, and we need to go into that in further detail. Now, Lincoln did consistently stand against slavery. He really did believe that slavery was a moral wrong. And the Republicans themselves were often called free soilers. And free soilers believed that all new states particularly should be free states. They should not have slavery out of there. The problem was they didn't always view these things from a moral high ground. Most of the reason why they didn't want slavery in these new states was because they did not want slave labor to compete with essentially white people. In fact, the Republican Party was called by one of its founders the white man's party. And Lincoln himself, between 1854 and 1860, would publicly, some 16 different times, declare that he did not believe African Americans were equal to white Americans. So even though he was principally against slavery, it wasn't always for the most noble reasons. Now, I have no interest in trying to make Lincoln into a villain. He was not a villain. He really was a good man. But like all of us, he was colored by the problems of his time. And so Lincoln, who often saw things very clearly from moral grounds, was also sometimes sometimes saw things through a bad lens. But still, the whole point is this: Lincoln really was a Unionist. In fact, let me read to you part of a letter he wrote to the famous abolitionist Horace Greeley. He wrote this in 1862. "My paramount object in this struggle, which would be the Civil War, is to save the Union. It is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. If I could save the Union by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I would do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union." And so that really was the motivation that actually drove Lincoln. So for example, Lincoln is famous for giving the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves in the South. At least that's what we commonly think. However, when you read the Emancipation Proclamation, you see that it has all of these qualifiers or limits put upon it. In fact, the Emancipation Proclamation only freed the slaves in the portions of the South which the Union troops did not control or occupy. In other words, Lincoln had the opportunity with the Emancipation Proclamation to free slaves in places like Kentucky, Tennessee, Missouri, or Maryland, or Delaware, and he chose not to. In fact, when he walked on his way to the White House every day, he passed by a slave market. He did nothing about that slave market. It wouldn't be until a constitutional amendment actually righted slavery by getting rid of it that that slave market would actually be closed down. And so Lincoln really was not a man who was always morally opposed to slavery. He used it primarily as a military measure. The Emancipation Proclamation was designed to allow slaves to run away from their masters' homes and create havoc in the South, thus preventing the South from effectively fighting the war. So unfortunately, this proclamation, which is still beautifully written, was not always done on the best grounds. Another issue that we see during the war is that Lincoln and the Republicans and the Unionists had no problem in using African Americans as slave labor in the construction of their fortresses. So for example, you get a place like Fort Negley in Nashville, which was built at the cost, they estimate, of 600 to 800 slaves' lives, which is an incredible toll for building any structure. It actually harkens back to some of the stats we get from antiquity. The other thing that we see about Lincoln was that Lincoln really was a statist. He really did believe the state was the greatest organizing force for good. That's why he supported things like the tariff, or subsidies, or the control of trade by the government, or fiat money. In fact, in 1862, Lincoln created fiat money. That was paper money that was not backed by gold or silver and was only controlled in value, technically, by the government, but even the government can finally control that. He also established things such as the first income tax and created the IRS in 1862. It would be shut down and resurrected later by Woodrow Wilson, but it really began with Lincoln himself. He was a man who shot down peace proposals by the Confederate States because he did not believe that they should be allowed to exist separately. So even as late as March of 1862, When the Confederates proposed a peace plan in which they would pay for Fort Sumter, which they had conquered, he rejected even hearing the negotiations of that peace plan. He also rejected letting Napoleon III, who was the King of France, negotiate between the South and the North. It was Union or nothing. And so during the war, Lincoln made incredibly tough decisions that really reflect someone who was so committed to the idea of union and to political union that he was willing to actually be like a dictator. It would be during the course of the war that he would imprison over 13,000 political dissidents. Those are people who actually opposed or spoke out against his policies or the policies of the Union government. And of course, it wasn't like Lincoln was doing all this directly. He had a large administration and really a Union army under his command to do these things. But the point is this: they happened under his leadership. These people were imprisoned without charge. People such as the entire legislature of the state of Maryland, who was trying to secede, and Lincoln prevented them from seceding. Because if they seceded with Virginia, that would make Washington, D.C. in the middle of two states who were no longer a part of the Union. He imprisoned them for 2 years. He also occupied Delaware with military troops, would do the same in places like Kansas and Kentucky, putting both of them under martial law, that essentially is a rule by the military. Many of these dissidents, including men like Francis Key Howard, who was the grandson of the writer of the Star-Spangled Banner, were imprisoned in Fort McHenry in Baltimore, ironically the same place where his grandfather had written the Star-Spangled Banner. He would also close hundreds of newspapers that actually spoke out about his violations of the Constitution. Newspapers, for example, such as the New York Daily News, the Brooklyn Eagle, the Louisville Courier, the Maryland News Sheet, or the Philadelphia Evening Journal. These were newspapers from all over the country. And even though he stood against secession, the whole idea that states could actually secede from the Union, he actually encouraged West Virginia to secede from Virginia. As a result, Lincoln, when he was reelected in 1864, was praised by men who had a similar nationalistic viewpoint. Both Karl Marx and Giuseppe Garibaldi, the actual one who unified Italy violently, both praised Lincoln as being a modern hero. And if you're a true modernist, which means you're a statist, then Lincoln is indeed a hero. Now, the whole point is not to make Lincoln into this villain. It's to show you that Lincoln had a very distinctive worldview. And that worldview was dangerous because he applied it fully and with full faith.